That sounds familiar. In fact, it sounds familiar in several aspects. If you are a classical music fan, you'll recognize the first two tones as the Diabolus in Musicus, the devil's interval. Named as such in medieval times, technically the first two notes are an augmented fourth interval, ba-da. For example, A to D sharp. It's dissonant. In general, when we hear music, we're listening for harmony. This interval does the exact opposite. Often when used in a piece of music, the augmented fourth thankfully resolves itself by ending a semitone higher to add the nearly perfect fifth. Ba-da-da. Conductor Marin Alsop described these augmented fourth interval notes as an interval that requires a resolution. And without resolution, it just hangs there and makes you uncomfortable. These three notes sound familiar because they resemble the notes we associate with the shofar blast, but more about that later. These three notes also sound familiar because they begin the prologue for a Leonard Bernstein musical called West Side Story. All the West Side Story creators were Jewish: Leonard Bernstein, Jerome Robbins, Arthur Lawrence, and Stephen Sondheim. But that's not the only reason for the shofar-sounding notes at the beginning. Bernstein has been quoted as saying that the notes just sounded to him like a call to action, and only later did he realize that they sounded like tekiah on a shofar. As a musical trope, in addition to the prologue, they also appear in the song Maria and Cool from the musical. Now, some of you are currently mentally humming Maria, and that's right, or boy, boy. Anyway, that's from Cool, and some of you have never seen West Side Story, so it's a project for another day for you, but when you see it, you'll probably hear the notes and say, oh yeah, it's kind of a shofar. Jerome Robbins' original idea was for a musical called East Side Story, which was a Romeo and Juliet type tale about a Jewish girl and an Italian Catholic boy on the New York's Lower East Side in a season when Passover and Easter coincide. The commercial appeal of this failed to get any traction, and instead a Puerto Rican girl became the Juliet character, and the result allowed Bernstein, who incidentally had an Orthodox Russian Jewish upbringing, to instead use the Latin rhythms and percussion that pervade the score of West Side Story. I know if Bernstein composed the score around the high holiday time, or maybe he didn't, but somehow ba-da-da was in his musical DNA. The shofar blast is not exactly like Bernstein's notes, but its image and sound is in each of our religious DNA strands also. The ram's horn has been enigmatic at many epic moments in Jewish history. It was significant in the story of the Akedah, the binding of Isaac. God told Abraham, I don't want you to sacrifice your son, and instead, poof, there was a ram with its horns stuck in a nearby thicket. The ram's horn blast also features in the scene at Mount Sinai, the only time in history when God directly revealed a message to the Jewish people. According to the Torah, all the people simultaneously heard a shofar blast, longer and louder than imaginable. We read that there were thunderclaps and lightning flashes and a thick cloud upon the mountain, and that a very powerful blast of the shofar and the entire nation that was in the camp shuddered. The shofar blast has historically been a battle cry, a declaration of victory and of monumental occasions. 40 years after the encounter with God at Sinai, the people of Israel were poised to enter the Promised Land. Regarded as the key to the land, Jericho was the first city Joshua and the Israelites would need to defeat. Following Joshua's instructions, the Israelites encircled Jericho. They marched around the city walls, led by the priests who carried the Holy Ark, and sounded the shofar. This performance was repeated for 7 days. And on the seventh day, the people gave a great shout, and the walls of the city collapsed, according to the Torah. As recorded in the book of Judges in around 1160 BCE, following God's command, Gideon took 300 men to fight against the mighty Midianite army, which was poised to attack Israel. Each man had with him a torch, a clay pitcher, and a shofar. They shattered the pitchers and blew the shofar, thoroughly frightening the surprised Midianite troops. Then they slew their enemies and drove the remainder from the land. A century later, during a disastrous war with the Philistines, the Holy Ark was captured, and for many years it remained in exile. After King David captured Jerusalem in about 1000 BCE, he famously paraded the Ark to a specially prepared tent in his new capital amidst much singing, dancing, and shofar blowing. Later in his reign as king, David had chosen his wise son Solomon to succeed him, but there were others who wanted the throne as well. So in order to make things clear, Solomon was pronounced king while his father was still alive. After Solomon was appointed by Zadok the priest, all the people declared, "Long live King Solomon," and the shofar was blown. This was followed by the playing of flutes and other musical instruments. In modern times, too, after the inauguration of each president of Israel, the shofar is blown. 66 years ago, when Israel took back the Western Wall in the Six-Day War, the shofar was sounded to mark the rejoining of a remnant of the temple and the Jewish people. At times, the shofar was used as an alarm. "Will a shofar be sounded in the city and the people not quake?" said the prophet Amos. In ancient times, a lookout would sound the shofar to warn of approaching enemy troops. And here at CBT, our minhag is to blow the shofar every Shabbat during Elul to remind the congregation of the coming of the high holidays. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs likens the shofar blasts on the high holidays to the satellite navigation system of our soul. It summons us to get on track with our lives. The occasion of asking God to write us in the book of life helps us to remember our goals in life. Like the calm voice of the GPS hearing the shofar when we are headed individually or societally in the wrong direction should trigger that voice in our head that advises us, "Please make a U-turn at the next legal opportunity." In fact, our cars are a good example of our misguided fascination with the shiny objects of modern life. 150 years ago, when all we had were horses and carriages, the average speed in the streets of a big city, New York or London, for example, was 10 miles an hour. Today, we have 8-cylinder souped-up gas guzzlers and electric vehicles together on our crowded roads, and the average road speed in large cities is 10 miles an hour. Once a year, triggered by the organizing reminder of the shofar blast, we need to examine where we are and where we are going. The nav system of our soul, the shofar, reminds us of our ultimate destination and the search for how to get there. The blowing of shofar on Rosh Hashanah, the first day of Tishrei, is commanded in the Torah. We read in Bamidbar 29:1, "In the 7th month, on the first day of the month, you shall observe a sacred occasion. You shall not work at your occupation. You shall observe it as a day when the horn is sounded." This led the sages to teach that we blow the shofar because we are commanded to do so. But this "because God said so" rationale has not been enough explanation to lastingly compel us over centuries of Jewish scholarly debate. Maimonides, the Rambam, was first to famously explore the relationship of the shofar and Rosh Hashanah. In his book Hilchot Teshuvah, The Laws of Repentance, we read, "Even though the sounding of the shofar on Rosh Hashanah is a scriptural decree, nonetheless it contains within it a hint as to its purpose, namely, wake up, you slumberers, from your sleep, examine your deeds, return in repentance, and remember your Creator, you who forget the truth and the follies of time and waste the whole year in vain pursuits that neither profit or save." In the Talmud, scholars argued that the shofar was there to represent our appearance before God as we asked for consideration of the sacrifices that we and our ancestors made when we are judged for the next year. The shofar, to many Talmudic scholars, was our cry to God. Maimonides says the opposite. The shofar is God's cry to us. It's God's way of saying what God said to the first humans in the Garden of Eden: "Where are you?" It asks the question, what have you done with the life, freedom of choice, and blessings that you were giving? What have you done this year? About 5 years ago, an author, David Brooks, wrote the book, The Road to Character. In it, he defined 2 different types of human virtues: resume virtues and eulogy virtues. Resume virtues are those that we include in our resume. They're our achievements, our skills, our qualifications. However, eulogy virtues are those on which we are ultimately judged. Were we kind and honest? What were our ideals, and did we live by them? We don't write these on our resume, but they're the main contributors to how we live, who we are, and what impact we have on those around us. Brooks writes, "We live in a society that encourages us to think about how to have a great career, but that leaves many of us inarticulate about how to cultivate our inner life. This is what Maimonides meant when he advises that we not waste the whole year in vain pursuits that neither profit nor save. It's not that resume virtues are unimportant. It's that they're not all important. They don't have enduring importance. It's the deep character traits that determine the truly important factors: the quality of our relationships, the achievement of a meaningful life, the contribution to others around us, and the love we give and receive. This is what Maimonides says is inherent in the shofar call, God's plea for us to try to make a difference. So Brooks writes that you know when you're in the presence of someone who has eulogy virtues, they seem to possess an impressive inner cohesion. They're not leading fragmented lives. They're grounded, they have roots, and they seem to know what matters in the long run. They're not readily blown off course by storms, and they're not crumbling in the face of adversity. They radiate a sort of moral joy. This internal strength results in an impact on the others whose lives they touch. This sets up the template for the cheshbon hanefesh, the inner reflection on our souls that we are to perform on the days of awe between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. None of us as individuals can end climate change, bring peace in the Middle East, cure worldwide disease, or change internal attitudes, or change international attitudes. But we can each do our individual best. We can each use the wake-up call of the shofar to cultivate a better inner life with humility and forgiveness and kindness towards others that allows God's blessings to flow through us to the rest of the world. Rather than being a musical tritone, dissonant and begging for resolution, we can be a solid, true shofar note of tekiyah, an expression of moral joy and a trigger of the same in others around us. A story is told of two elderly Jews who have not seen each other in many decades, Chaim and Moshe. Chaim moved away for his business, and he returns now to the town in his retirement for the high holidays and comes to the synagogue that he and Moshe attended as young men. They meet, they recognize each other, they embrace, and after services, they go back to Moshe's apartment to talk of the old days. They talk for hours, reminiscing about old times, catching up on time apart, and vowing to make more time for each other in the future. It had become dark outside, so Chaim asked Moshe, "Look at your watch, what time is it?" "I don't have a watch," said Moshe. Chaim says, "Okay, then look at the clock, what time is it?" "Look around," says Moshe, "I don't have a clock here either." "Well then, how do you tell time?" said Chaim. "You see that shofar on the table? That's how I tell time." "You are a crazy old man," said Chaim. "How can you tell time with a shofar?" "I'm not so crazy. Here, I'll show you," says Moshe. He picks up the shofar, goes to the open window, and blows a deafening blast on the shofar. 30 seconds later, an angry neighbor shouts out, "2:30 in the morning and you're blowing the shofar?" Moshe turned to Chaim. "You see, that's how you tell time with the shofar." Now, that's not different from Maimonides' message. The Rambam tells us that the shofar commands us to wake up, wake up. God is saying, do you know what time it is? This life I gave you, have you used it to hurt or to heal? Last year you asked for a year in the book of life. What will be your entry in the book this year? One beauty of Judaism is that every year we're called to reflect upon how we have spent our time. Did we chase resume virtues of transient worth or eulogy virtues of which we can be truly proud? God gives us each time in equal proportions. It's one of God's greatest gifts to us. Regardless of our wealth, our power, and our varied desires, God gives each of us 24 hours in a day and a lifespan that sometimes feels too short. Each of us, just like Moses, will probably have a future we'll never see, a river we'll not cross, a promised land we will not enter. Therefore, each of us will have to make choices about our actions today, and the most consequential choice is, how will we spend the time God gave us? In some ways, the best way to spend our time defines itself. Very few people have died wishing they spent more time at the office or at committee meetings, and fewer still died wishing they had the iPhone 16 before their neighbor. Most of the things we chase during our days are far less consequential in the big picture than some of the things we fail to make time for. Stopping to talk to our neighbor, volunteering to help at our congregation, visiting the sick, teaching a child, saying thank you to a family member, saying thank you to God. These are the essences of a life well lived and a good use of the time we are gifted. Once a year, we need that shofar blast to wake us up to what really matters, to remember to use time to make a difference in the world around us, and to try to be a blessing. Ken Yehi Ratzon.